So the question really there was just no dispute that he had mental illness. Even the prosecutors essentially conceded that. So the question was, what role did that mental illness play in the events of killing Casey? We had doctors look at him. We gathered as many records as we could find to sort of put together the pieces of Johnny's life. And ultimately, that his mental illness, his schizophrenia, essentially prevented him from coolly reflecting on his conduct, that he was just not somebody who thought through conduct, coolly reflected on anything in his life.
We spent a lot of time together. I remember a lot of times he thought he was the Incredible Hulk. One time I can remember he jumped off the concrete steps and landed on his head. And a pretty traumatic experience. My mom had to rush him to the ER. I guess I was about 8 years old, so I didn't quite understand the severity of it. He'd done this quite a few times in his life. He thought he was a superhero, and it didn't work out too well.
So he did start doing some cutting. He was self-mutilating at times. He would cut his arms, and he would come to me and he'd say, "I cut myself again, and I don't know why I'm doing it. I can't seem to control myself."
What struck me about the case and what I wrote about was that Johnny Johnson had been diagnosed with depression and then schizophrenia, and had been sent to an agency that deals with people with mental health issues. And shortly before the murder, they dropped Johnny Johnson from the rolls. And I remember thinking, when it came up, when the murder came up and found out that background, I was thinking, well, how odd that is.
I worked for a mental health case management agency, which is contracted by the Department of Mental Health and Department of Corrections. Johnny was my youngest when I met him. He had just been released from prison for, I think, stealing a lawnmower or something. The contract with the Department of Corrections was for me to see him 3 times a week. We had a great relationship, meeting with him. He was abiding by everything. And then after a while, he would not show up at his appointed places. I went to his grandmother's home. Grandmother said he wasn't there. I had his girlfriend's number. Girlfriend said he was sick, was not feeling well. Just excuses. And then there was silence. I couldn't find him. Knowing what I had known about his possibly drinking with his medications and his possibly not taking his medications, I wrote a letter to his home and sent the letter also to the probation officer. The reason why I wrote the letter was to trigger the Department of Corrections or Department of Mental Health to find him and bring him back into the fold. And I was sure the Department of Corrections probation officer would see that letter and definitely say, put an APB out, go pick him up wherever you see him and bring him back. I sent the letter because I needed to make everybody aware that I can't find him, I haven't seen him, and therefore I'm not providing care.
So they dropped Johnny Johnson at the end of June, as I remember, and the murder was in July.
It was July. I was having surgery. I was in the hospital. And there was this news story about a young girl going missing. And I remember laying in the bed in the hospital, and there was Johnny Johnson on the news. His face, my heart dropped. And I called my office, talked to my supervisor, and I checked my messages. And the probation officer had left her first message about the letter I sent saying, "Hey, this is so-and-so. I'm calling about the letter you sent."
Yeah, a lot of the public don't have mental illness, in their families. That's a shame. If they would try to raise a mental ill person for 6 months in their house, they could understand maybe.
When Beth and I would meet with Johnny, and he would sometimes describe these hallucinations, which were clearly real to him, yet even our listening to it, a skeptic would think he was making them up, even when he had no reason to make them up.
He said he was hearing voices. He didn't know how to explain it, so he drew that picture to try to show what it feels like. Because he said it felt like bugs was crawling underneath his skin and in his brain. And I thought the picture was pretty telling.
John drew this.
Feeling of being eaten alive.
Being eaten alive. Voices.
Hurt yourself.
Voices hurt yourself.
Vision, shadow.
Vision, shadows. And then visions.
That he has these kind of feelings. I can't even imagine what that thought process is.
Too, Johnny, like I said, he's mentally ill, easily led. The detectives interviewed him, I forgot how many hours.
The date is July 27th, 2002. The time is 12:50 a.m.
And if you tell him something with that auditory processing disorder he has, and you tell him that and tell him that and tell him that, then he'll just agree with what you tell him.
076. The person being interviewed at this time is Johnny Johnson. And what was your plan once you'd finished having sex with her? To kill her.
It was obvious to us you could lead him into saying anything. And if it's the detective who needs to have an aggravator, in Johnny's case, well, then you have to say he tried to rape her. Well, that gives you the aggravator. Once you get the aggravator, that gets you death.
I represent primarily clients who have received the death penalty in what's called post-conviction litigation. It was undisputed during the trial that Johnny suffers from some form of schizophrenia. All the doctors that have ever seen Johnny have all agreed that he suffers from schizophrenia of some form or another.
Johnny is so sick, and in many ways sort of fell through the cracks in terms of the educational system, the mental health system.
If anybody had asked me, all of my clients, if one of my clients was going to do this, Johnny wouldn't have been even on the top 10 list of clients who would have done this. But a lot of times when they're not taking their medications and they have the hallucinations or whatever the psychosis is, combined with illicit drugs or alcohol, this is possible. This is possible. Then your demons take charge of your mind. You're not in control anymore.
I'd like to see Johnny go back to a new penalty phase so that a jury could see that Johnny's brain just does not work correctly and that he does not deserve to die. This case is a horror, and the only way to make it more horrible would be to put Johnny to death. With a guy whose brain doesn't work, the state just shouldn't kill him.
I think capital punishment sort of sells a bill of goods that, okay, well, if we do this, we will feel better. We would have taken care of the problem, and we really haven't. I think the money that we use on capital cases could be used in prevention, could be used for victim services. So I just don't think it's a viable societal solution for anything.
Let's say Johnny Johnson is schizophrenic, but yet he knew right from wrong. In other words, should the fact that he has a psychotic illness preclude him from death, as we have drawn the line with mental retardation now, and with individuals involved in murders under the age of 18? That may be the common ground that we could all settle on, that if he's going to be convicted and you're going to put him in prison, he has schizophrenia, then let's don't execute him.
Johnny is a client who I feel very strongly about. I like Johnny. I feel that Johnny does not deserve to die? Should I tell him that it doesn't matter what you guys do here today? When I go back and tell Johnny what happened, he'll just nod and say, okay. He'll nod and say, okay, if you guys uphold his death sentence. He'll nod and say, okay, if you decide that he stays the rest of his life in prison. He'd nod and say, okay, if you said that he would go home tomorrow. He doesn't understand that eventually, if things don't change, that he'll be dead. He doesn't really get that.
Thank you, Your Honor. But please, the court. Johnny Johnson has a mental disability. In this state, we don't kill people who have mental disabilities. There is no doubt that he has a mental disease. It is the worst mental disease that a person can have. The jury heard, and it is proven beyond a reasonable doubt, that Johnny has...
It's not easy for society to do anything or figure this out, because somebody like Johnny Johnson had been identified as a person with mental problems, had been referred to a psychiatrist, had been referred to an agency, was on medication, and when someone like Johnny Johnson gets off medication, leaves his support system behind, in his case, his grandmother, it's difficult really to know who to blame.
Everybody knows that if Johnny's death sentence is allowed to stand, someday they will put a needle in his arm and put enough drugs into his body to end his life. That he'll be strapped down to a gurney. He'll be given some drugs to calm him down so that he doesn't resist when they go to kill him. It's gut-wrenching that we as a society would decide, okay, this person has to die.
I can't reconcile him being killed. I mean, it will not make anything any better. Society needs to take some part of that blame, and he should remain in an institution for the rest of his life. But the death penalty, I don't think it's right in his case.
The reality is this: once somebody picks up a gun and goes in and robs a gas station and kills the clerk, I don't particularly care why they did it. Once you pick up a gun and go rob somebody, I don't care what kind of a childhood you had. I don't care how badly your mother treated you. It doesn't matter to me.